Welcome, and to those of you in the room and those of you on the web via webcast. I've slightly shortened the title just to fit on the first slide, but today I'm going to be looking at some of the user issues there are in the apparently simple task of reading when it comes to working with digital books. Now, it's one of these statements that's sort of blindingly obvious, that reading is not, in fact, a simple activity. It's a very complex thing. Most of us take over a decade to acquire anything like reasonably good reading skills in the sense of operational within the adult world. And it's been studied a lot. There have been lots of taxonomies of reading that have been produced over the years from different disciplines. They have divided the task of reading in different ways, depending on whether you've looked at it from a psychological perspective and you're reading about the neuropsychology, what happens in the mind at the neural level. And of course, some people have looked at it as a social activity, some people have looked at it as a human-computer interaction problem, which I'll be covering today. And I think we should take a moment just to remember that reading has been on paper for quite a while. But reading's actually something that isn't, in fact, a very simple reification of what we normally do with computers. If you just look at this photograph, and it's a pretty typical reading posture, this person is reading their book. I can tell you it's a book about the Battle of Blenheim by the brother of Princess Diana. It's actually sitting in their lap. And most often, well, we can sort of do that with a computer laptop, but it's going to be pointing in a different direction unless you're using a tablet PC. And in fact, she's doing something very straightforward, which is just using her finger to mark a place where she is in the text. It might be somewhere she's about to read or that she's just read. It might be partially that she's keeping the book open with the palm of her hand. But there are actually quite a lot of things going on in this one very simple photograph. And reading in that sort of way is a very variegated and complex task. We don't know why this person happens to be rereading the book. It might be she's interested in it because of the author. It may be she's interested in the Battle of Blenheim for some reason. I don't know. It was taken at a book fair, so quite possibly it's just something she happened to pick up when she was there. One thing we need to understand is that reading has many purposes. Reading for pleasure, reading for knowledge, and umpteen other possibilities besides. And there are also different reading styles. Now, one word that's being used is active reading, and I'm going to avoid that today for a few reasons. But active reading tends to be characterized as the user interacting with the text as quite a physical level, annotating, underlining, rather than simply taking the text as a pure, untouchable item in which they have no agency, a more passive approach. Reading also might be reflective, rereading passages repeatedly to understand them, as students outside in the library here might well be doing for some texts they don't quite understand just yet. Or it could be actually quite sequential, and even within sequences it might be partial or complete. So again, there are lots of ways we can think about reading styles. Now, what I'm just going to say at this point is I'm going to cover almost nothing of that today. I'm going to instead take a very particular angle and look at reading as a critical activity within the task of information seeking. And that's where I've come from, because I've been studying digital libraries for 10, 11 years now. I've been working with the Greenstone project, which is the reason for that funny axe thing up in the top left-hand corner. That's a gift that was given to the Greenstone team, the New Zealand Digital Library project, by the First Nation people of New Zealand, the Māori, are one of their iwi. And I'm at City University London, so that's why I have that other daft logo up there. But seeking gives us a particular context for understanding some things. Not all things, but certain things that happen within the activity of reading. There are lots of definitions of information seeking, but I rather hokey term for it is it's the process by which users find information relevant to their needs. And the important acts here are finding and the judgment of relevance and an understanding of their needs, all of which actually can vary over time. And it is a bit of a cliche that people have assumed that we now use digital catalogues of some form, but we also use social tools. I once interviewed someone at the University of Waikato, a historian, a medievalist in fact, who said, "I never use computers to find information." And yet, how did he interact with most of his colleagues across the world? Email. He was using people, certainly, but he's communicating with them via computer. And so there are many agents involved in information seeking, and for that reason, it's almost always a highly complex and fluid task involving talking to colleagues and friends, using particular resources that are ready to hand, finding new things. And because, of course, it's an interesting area, lots of people have built different models of it, and I'm going to touch on 3 of those for just a moment, because they, I think, are quite relevant to some of the things that will come up later. I've always been particularly taken by David Ellis's information-seeking model, and 2 of the items I think within it that are particularly relevant to the act of reading are the behaviours he terms chaining and extracting. Now, chaining isn't just simply citation chaining. It's any way in which you move from some point to identifying a new potential source of information. So chaining could occur socially. I've been watching people in bookstores, and often it's the recommendations that are being made by friends that are very important to what people decide to read next. It doesn't have to be a citation in the academic sense. And also extracting is something I've studied humanists of various forms, particularly historians and literature scholars, and they do a lot of extracting from reading, noting down and reinterpreting, critiquing and reflecting on what they're reading as they do it. So there's lots of what you would call sense-making going on here too. 2 other models I think are actually particularly relevant. Carol Coulthau has a model built on her observation of students engaged in a authoring task, and the sort of level which uncertainty changes within their perception of what their task is as they go through it. As they discover more sources, they become more confident, or if they find they've hit a brick wall, they sort of collapse and become miserable, I guess. And then you've got Nick Belkin, who has the anomalous state of knowledge model, where in a different way he's interested in the uncertainty in the reader's mind about what it is they're really looking for and how to express it. Now, there are other models besides, like I really like Gary Marcinini's model, but I think these 3 ones are actually the ones that are most directly relevant to reading. And I've been trying to think about how to represent reading in the context of information seeking, and I've come up with this, which I can't say is proven in any way, but it merely mirrors what I've observed, and goodness knows how many hours of observing people in the flesh, sometimes with their permission. So we've got the actual act of finding information on the right-hand side, but that's actually not something that happens in separation to the rest of the world. I have been undertaking a lot of research on the task of triage. I've got lots of medical people in my family, so if in doubt, I always throw in a medical term. So in document triage or information triage, you're trying to select out the information that fits your needs or is relevant, and anything that passes that point you go on to read, where I think in many ways your primary task, not your only task, is in some way examining the information that you've come across. And obviously this may not actually be text, it might be data in the case of a scientist doing some work. But from reading, and this is something that we should remember, reading has many roles to play. People will start targeting new information because they identify anomalies in what they don't yet know, using Belkin's model, because they're chaining references, perhaps in a very direct reflection of David Ellis's model, or because they have a rising sense of uncertainty, to take Carol Coulthow's model, which drives them into further seeking. So reading and seeking, I think, are in many contexts, but not all, deeply interrelated. Now, this sort of sets up some of my biases here, because I'm not interested in people reading Heat or any of the sort of many glossy magazines there are to describe what celebrities are doing. It's quite possible this model applies there, but I'd be surprised. I'm really interested in professional, often scholarly, but not always so reading. For instance, lawyers are probably not scholarly in the academic sense, but certainly need to be very selective about their information. Now, within information seeking, there has been some interest on this sort of interchange. And it would be fair to say that historically, there has been some research that's looked particularly at information seeking, and some that has looked at reading, but often these have been divided from each other. So, whilst Carol Coulthouse certainly mentions lots of reading in her report of the data that led her to build her model, the actual act of reading is not in any way the primary focus of her research, nor is it an equal focus. Myself, Frank Shipman at Texas A&M University, and a couple of other people have been looking at triage. And this has started to rise in the attention and focus of the digital library community for about the last 10 years, but particularly the last 5. On the other hand, I find it surprising that chaining in its various forms, and perhaps there's a better term than the one I've coined here, seems to be rather neglected. And this is something I'll pick up on in a couple of later slides as well. So when we are reading within the context of information seeking, there are certain things that might happen, and these are just a selection, as all taxonomies are. We might be trying to find particular facts. What day was Napoleon born on, for the sake of argument? We might be deliberately trying to reinterpret the text in front of us, as a literature scholar has to do. Can they use post-colonial theory to understand the poems of Dylan Thomas? Confirming hypotheses, or rejecting them, I guess, is an alternative. But also, and this is something that I think we underplay here, is reading also inspires new ideas, new directions for intellectual endeavour for people who are looking at a text. And this includes lawyers too. I can see a way of defending my client from what seems an impossible situation. But even within all those, sometimes things are going to be very attentive and systematic, and sometimes they're going to be very selective and opportunistic. But let's just sort of reflect on the characteristics of the task that emerges from this. We need to extract information for later use. We need to interpret text in the context of what we're up to, what's our goal. We might need to connect between multiple texts, because books don't stand on their own, whichever they are. And this is something I keep on doing wrong myself. Remembering to note down where I got that idea and what the idea was. I spent half an hour yesterday trying to remember the fact that Heather had said, she used a ruler for underlining sometimes. It was a really good example for something I wanted to have. So it took me half an hour to remember it. What a klutz. But anyway, we've got those sorts of backgrounds. Now, just sort of about 3 more slides to look at this sort of area. What we should remember is the reader isn't just we in the UK refer to jug and mug learning. The students see themselves as a passive vessel, and the expert, who's probably someone other than me, says wonderful, amazing stuff, and it pours the information into the student's head, and they are transformed and taken to a different place just by the water of knowledge pouring into their mug. Now, I actually don't think readers read like that, and I don't think students actually study them like that. I am basically, I guess, a constructivist, really, in my own approach. But I think users of technology and readers of texts do construct their own understanding, however implicit or well-formed or vague or explicit, of the texts. And this is actually what they're doing with that, specific to the task that they're doing. In the sense of reading a novel, this isn't that important, actually. You're trying to make sure you know what the story is doing, But if it's Agatha Christie, you know there'll be some twist at the end where although all your attempts to find out who was guilty will be subverted by the hidden clue you didn't get told about earlier on. Users may also be facing high uncertainty, and I think this is an element of motivation in information seeking that's highly deterministic of how thorough people are. If you're pretty sure what you're doing, it's quite amazing the amount of obvious counter-evidence you'll overlook. Conversely, actually, if you're uncertain, you're really trying to make sure you've got it right. And texts don't get scanned once. This is not an OCR task. They will tend to be returned to multiple times, however partially and however incompletely. And for example, if you remember my brief model, the triage tasks means you've almost seen the document once before you start reading it in depth. So it's very seldom you're just going to pick up a thing and read it in depth once and never read it again. Rereading is an important part of what you do. And on that theme, we also have to remember we've got information seeking where new goals may emerge and be identified, existing goals may be eliminated or revised, and there's all the sense making. Now, if we just pause for a moment and think about that, it tells us there's an awful lot going on in the reading task, which may be stating the obvious, but I've just sort of teased out some of those things, and I'll be picking up on them when I look at some of the tools that people are currently using and why they may or may not work. A mini rant. My other background's in history, so I love having history moments. So this is where you have to suffer me being a historian. We started off with text basically being in languages like cuneiform, not just cuneiform, and on clay tablets. Portability was pretty sucky in those days, right? Now, look what Britain went to get hold of the Rosetta Stone. We invaded a whole country, we brought it back home, we keep on telling people we're not going to hand it back. Then we moved on to having scrolls, which actually, I'd argue, this is sort of where we're at technologically on the web now. We have scrolls. We do literally have scrolling, but we're sort of about that level of sophistication. And then we moved on to having folios and sheets that were, variously dealt with in good or bad ways, until we finally end up with bound books of paper. And it's worth remembering that even then things didn't stop. As a historian, I can tell you, if you go back to 1810, you will not find back of the book indexes and that sort of thing. So lots of contents for navigation within the book are actually relatively novel. And now we've then added on with the technology, and I'm a computer scientist, we've had cathode ray tubes, if you remember those things, liquid crystal displays, projectors like you're looking at right now, and then things like electronic ink, or what's sometimes called digital paper. Now, that last two parts has led to digital reading being studied by people like Duchniki and Collars, Andrew Dillon, and so on from the early 1980s onwards. And even then, it was quite apparent, if you go back to the old papers from SIGGRAPH, for instance, that had quite a lot of research on this domain, there were some clear issues. The reading rate on screen was slower. There were problems with extended periods of reading. You just couldn't keep going for as long. This was hypothesized it was due to eye strain. Amber monitors, for those of you who can remember the early 80s, were more popular because they were easier to read than green. And also, bizarrely, and this one's still sort of being rumbled over, the retention of facts, not immediate comprehension, but how long you retain stuff afterwards, appears to have been reduced. And the thing that did vary is that some studies said these effects are very small and not significant, and other studies said they were very big. And I would suggest to you that there probably were reasons why people came to those different conclusions, and one of those would be what was the user doing and what was the task, to state the obvious. But digital reading, despite these deficits, has had big claims made for how wonderful it is. Here are 3 things that are wonderful on digital paper. Search within documents. Now, Fernando, my RA, and I published a paper a while back on what we call the myth of find, because people don't use it. And according to Dan Russell at Google, people don't use it. And according to Andy Coburn and Jason, whose PhD, Jason Alexander, people don't use it either. So perhaps it's not. Why aren't people using it? And I leave that as an open question. Cut and paste, which was originally given as a great big wonderful thing, is a problem once you've got the issue of copyright seriously considered. And actually the interaction of these sucks too, because you lose where you got it from, and sometimes that's an important part of the process, and you have to do that yourself, and you have to remember where you... yeah, disaster. And hyperlinks, which were, the great child of the World Wide Web, and they existed long before that. I would argue they're very author-centered things as they're currently used. They're not very useful for interpretation in a lightweight sense, and the term lightweight will come up in just a moment. So reading on paper, in contrast, has been put forward as being more natural, more intuitive, more lightweight, and there are certain things that are clearly better. It's easier to write on, for a number of reasons. You can tear, fold, and clip it, though I think most archivists might want to leave the room at this point. And you can, well, do all sorts of things to it. More importantly, I think this is a factor not to be overlooked, it's more readily held in comfort in different places than a cathode ray tube with an attached desktop PC will give you. I don't think that should be a surprise to us, and I think that's been one of the factors that's held things up, and that's clearly in the process of changing. But even if you've got very techie-savvy people with wonderful technology, they print to read lots of digital documents and then mark them up on paper. And I'd argue if computer scientists are doing it, there's got to be a reason for it, in the sense it's not about people being, rednecks in the backwoods where they like good old paper like Moses had or something like that. It's not that sort of issue. There's something else going on. Whereas digital reading, yes, we've got these difficulties with annotation. Actually, one other advantage is it's portable. One problem is you've got bit rot as formats decay, and they won't got any WordStar documents any longer. And on the other hand, bizarrely, and a mirror of that, you can reproduce it and do all these other things, but it's still far less than paper, just to summarize that. One thing that's recurred through the history of digital readings, people go, this new technology will solve all those old problems, is a done deal. Poppycock, I believe, is a popular term in the UK. I refrain from using something more colourful. So, there are things that have definitely improved. Basic readability is way better than 1980. But on the other hand, what we've observed, and what Fernando and I have observed, and Kathy Marshall and Andrew Dillon and a host of other people much smarter than I have observed, there's little change in actual behaviours in the sense of how much do people annotate, how long do people read for. There's a really nice paper by Wu and Jesus not long ago that hammered this one down. People just do small breaks of reading in relatively short bursts. So that's all the context. I've bored you enough on that. Let me bore you about my research now. I'll change the theme a little bit. You just need that for once. What I'd like to point out, before I go forward though, is Vannevar Bush was a very important person, and there was the As We May Think paper in Atlantic Monthly, and I think it was in 1947, but I might be wrong by a year. He wasn't looking for that sort of reading. He was looking for a more engaged, more interpretative, richer form of reading. So we're way off track here. And I'm a computer scientist, and I want to put that right. So I used to be at Swansea University. A number of my PhDs are still there, so what I'm about to describe has credit to both institutions. What we've been trying to do is, okay, we know it's a disaster. Why? What's actually causing it? And what we've managed to do is to have some success there. We have also been trying to find ways in which digital medium can actually be improved, not just knocking it. HCI as a discipline has a problem. We're very good at throwing bananas and mushy tomatoes. But actually, because our discipline's been increasingly influenced by psychology, we've had fewer and fewer programmers, and we don't tend to do new toys. We want to do some new toys, I admit. And basically, our hypothesis is that the HCI, the interaction deficits in these devices that we're going to be looking at moment and in the desktop software really are what are contributing to what you could call poor usability. Those are terms from IDME. And I think this is undermining how digital books can possibly work. I'm very influenced by Kathy Marshall. So that's another prejudice revealed. And she introduces the idea of lightweight interaction. And that's navigation that occurs either when people read a particular page or when they move within an article in a way that's so unself-conscious that they aren't apt to remember it later. Now, I'd slightly want to change that. I'm not going to put words in Kathy's mouth. I want to say lightweight reading is reading that occurs when people engage in the text in a way that is so unself-conscious that they aren't apt to remember it later. And that angle is something that, particularly looking at navigation, but not just that, something Jennifer Pearson, one of my very wonderful PhDs, has been looking at, and most of the next few slides are really her work. So placeholding is a really basic feature. If you go to the most rudimentary Sony reader device that you can buy, the PRS 300, geek moment, it has bookmarking but nothing else. So bookmarking, placeholding is really important, but it's really important for all sorts of reasons. It's not just about remembering where I stopped reading the last time. That's trivial, very easy to do. It's actually an important part of navigation. Particularly if someone's coming back to a document over time, they'll mark particular key elements. And we've all done that. Dog-eared stuff, dropped bookmarks in. I collect bookmarks. How sad is that? Not digital ones, that'd be really worrying, but never mind. But also, if you're comparing two places in the document, somewhere or other you're doing placeholding, and actually the hardware provided for that is here. I'll be careful which way I put that round. And it's really also something that may end up being a form of annotation or some form of index. Like there are those 3M sticky things that you can stick out the side, and then you start, in fact, indexing it, and people color code it and all sorts of stuff. So it's quite a rich behavior for something that is simply putting some sort of mark of a position in a text. You can use a number of media. Post-its. One of the academics I was looking at, who's a Walt Whitman scholar, would not do this. But one of his colleagues, who studies post-colonial literature of Wales, where she's reading, she always has a pad of Post-its by her side, and that's how she marks up what she's interested in. Dog-eared corners, like I was brought up on the principle of what Anne Fadiman calls the chaste model of reading. I would never turn the corner of a book. But I've observed people who turn the corner of the book over specifically so the corner points to the very word or phrase they're interested in. You can have loose paper or envelopes or anything else that you might want. And if you're being prim and proper like me, you might have a real bookmark of some form. But it's worthwhile thinking that these are really low technology, if ever it was. I think someone was showing me the other day a bookmark where it's on a string. You can move it up and down to point at the right place in the text. I think that's about as complex it's going to get, really. But some of this is about supporting writing notes, like the Post-it. It's got two functions, placeholding and potentially interpretation. Some things are purely signs, like if I put in the bookmark of York Minster for the sake of argument, it's probably not going to be particularly interesting that it's a York Minster leather bookmark I used. It's just a bookmark of some form. And you can co-opt other items. I pointed out fingers a moment ago. There's the thing where you fold two books together, and that actually is a very powerful thing. If you've got two books where the two pages are related to each other in some way, you're connecting the two books physically and intellectually. And you can even use back of the envelopes, which I have to admit is what I resort to in my office very often. And then we've got this. This is what you get in Adobe Acrobat. And you've got this nice panel down the side that's got chapter 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to point something out to you because there's a danger this talk might turn into me knocking Adobe Acrobat. It's a production tool. It was never there for reading. The reader is there for you to see something and to proofread it at a very simple level. But all these bookmarks, and this is Alice in Wonderland in particular edition, you have to, as an editor, put these in quite carefully in time sequence order and then move them around. It's not actually, in fact, a bookmark as we would understand it in the sense that we had in the physical world. This is very much a navigational truss, like an index. And a lot of digital bookmarks start from that very position. There are certain things that are different about that if you look at the digital readers, but on those, and I'll just give an example of a really bad digital design, on the Sony ones, if you put in a bookmark, you either have to have what's in effect the left-hand view here with no text, or to see a bookmark, you have to be on the page that bookmark is on. You can make physical bookmarks work like that if you have a small post-it and you put it within the corner of the book, next to the spine. But generally, it's not how we use them, right? They're generally much more visible. So Jen said, well, that sucks. And she built the visual bookmarking system, which I'll very quickly take you through now. We followed the telephone directory style thing, so this really wasn't being very cutesy. Down the right-hand side, you can see the tabs that indicate bookmarks after the current page. And on the left-hand side, you can see tabs that came before the current page. We don't know exactly where, but we can see them. And if you mouse over them, you can get some information. And we're not even too sure that's a useful feature, but we did it because we can. And if you just click on a bookmark, it takes you to that page. And the edge then is coloured with the colour of that bookmark. For some reason, that colour's not coming out very well, but there's a purple and a blue there. So that's one thing we looked at, and let's just say making bookmarks more visible really helps. People actually bookmark more often, they use the bookmarks more, but this was, if you will, the low-hanging fruit. This was a starting point. I want to apologise for one item of spelling on the next page, and I'll just say it was not me who spelt it that way, but I can't change the graphic. When people annotate, where do they put it? So let's move on from marking to annotation. Do they write over the document itself? Do they use a separate medium? Of course, the answer is obviously, well, it depends. And if it's in a document in some way, is it actually over the text of the document, which is what we mean by the first option, or is it in the margin? We did a study with real users using real paper. Shock horror. And the answer was in the margins. That's predominantly where people use. And this reproduces some research that's been done earlier. But we actually built a system, which I don't have time to show you, that essentially gave you bigger margins, and you didn't have to fit within the exact boundaries of the paper, and it was easier to use, and people did more annotation. So that pointed us towards pushing all those ideas together and coming up to the digital reading desk, where we have a text in the middle and some space around it. Now, obviously, we're relying on having some decent amount of screen estate here. But this was the easiest way to put it forward. We've got post-its down the right-hand side, and you can just drag and drop them onto the main page if you want. You can put some notes on the background. So this characters panel is just something the user's written. We've got some stuff on the desk, and Jen's very good at doing. I'm terrible at doing animations, so Jen did all this for me. We can see in this case, if you just go backwards and forwards, that red marker tells us on page 2, and when we go to that page, it's flipped over to the left-hand side in the way we had earlier. We also can put a post-it that overlaps the outside, and then it actually becomes a bookmark as well as a post-it, essentially. If we get to the end, we might actually be hiding a note behind the back of the book. And, forgot one thing, which is that this green one, for instance, you'll notice it doesn't appear because I've put the post-it into the middle of the text. So you can make it behave in different ways just by changing the position. So, really simple thing. And we did a lab study because we're HCI people, and that's what we do. And the simple answer was, it worked better. It was not as good as paper. There are all sorts of data on how often people do annotation on paper. And one problem we have is, of course, it depends on our task, and we don't know that effect and everything else. But the method that we used here is closer to how paper works in terms of its behaviour. It doesn't exactly mirror paper, I'm not being slavish to that. But all the little tweaks people have done before for annotation have not changed the rate of use. That's the thing that we've managed to do that's not been done before. We're getting people to annotate more. We've also looked at triage reading, which I will only briefly cover. But the simple truth is that, for some reason, people, if they're making their decision about whether they'll read a paper document, they'll read more pages, they'll read each page for a longer time, and they're more likely to choose longer documents. So there are ways in which, if it's about relevance for the same task, with the same document, something else is going on. So the lessons we can draw from that are that the artifacts that we can observe from our studies on paper and on computer indicate that there are differences in the quality, and I want to be careful about that word, of attention given to the text. And if we're looking at a longer text like a book, of course this is most relevant. You don't tend to annotate when you're reading a novel, but if you're reading a major textbook in a new area you're getting into, you might be much more descriptive. But quality in this sense, I want to be careful about that, is not necessarily in the simple sense of good or bad, but in the nature of the attention, the timbre, to use the musical term, not simply a sort of on-off switch. Now in HCI we look a lot at cognition, and I'm going to whistle through an idea, an approach to that. So cognition, in this sense, I will define in a moment, but it appears that attentive reading, which is what I think most people do with most books, is something that's really supported by all these secondary activities. And I'll be coming back to why I draw that conclusion later on. I'm giving you my ending and I'm going to build up to it. And triage reading, on the other hand, is not attentive reading. It has highly focused, and people don't annotate much in that task. They don't do things. So we deliberately were taking these as very different viewpoints of reading, because we thought we'd see differences, and we do. And both differ between paper and digital. Now, I would argue, a very simple thing, that if you're going to read a book, it's going to require a longer period of attention, albeit a broken period of attention, than reading an online news article on, say, the BBC. It's just a longer piece of text. It's more complex, it's got more argument to it, and I've sort of pointed out the fact that digital reading software has some basic problems that we can start to overcome. But, and this is an important problem, HCI has always looked at what you might call time and performance measures like error rates. Error rates in navigation are quite low, in fact. People don't accidentally turn to page 95 when they wanted to go to 215. They can type and they can check their numbers. Sure. But, and how long do these things take to do? Well, actually, time-wise, they're not that bad either. But still, they're failing. And why might that be? So, cognition's where I think that we have to look. Cognition is simply about how people reason or think about how to do and control a task. And what we seem to be building up a picture of, and we're now going to have to change our methods to mine this directly, is that the primary task of actually reading, if you will, is difficult in itself and demands a lot of cognition. Now, there are forms of cognition we call distributed or external cognition, where you use other tools to support what you're doing, like that post-it you put on your monitor or keyboard to remind you to do something. That's a form of external cognition. And what seems to be happening in the case of reading is annotation, etc., are supporting the primary task, giving cognitive attention to that, and therefore they are in themselves secondary tasks. They're not ends in themselves, they're means to the end of the primary task. Now, if that's the case, and I think there's lots of evidence that that is the case, we have to remember that digital reading software like Acrobat's been designed for production. traditionally. Adobe is not a reading software company. They do Illustrator, they do Photoshop, they want you to make media. And in that area, the role of Acrobat Professional is to help an editor mark up what needs to be changed in the document. So the primary task is editorial, and the secondary task is reading. And if that's the case, that even if that tool is actually well designed, it's got the wrong balance, if you will, and the wrong relationship between those tasks. In comparison, what seems to actually be the case in attentive reading is that we actually need these secondary tasks to take very low cognition. Bending the corner of a paper does not require a PhD. It certainly doesn't require you to start using files and menus and all sorts of other things. And what I think is happening, even in these very short interactions that are represented by those methods, is that the cognitive attention, this is a particular term we use in psychology, or cognitive focus, is being taken away from the primary reading task into this other world of controlling the annotation. And that is breaking the flow, to use a term that's been used many times, of the primary task, and that then breaks everything down. Now, if that's the case, then we need to actually change the way we design these to allow a very different type of behaviour. And we also have to remember that books have this broader reading context in the sense of the digital reading desk. And digital readers, I would argue, as in the sense of the software, and to some extent even therefore the user behaviour they provoke, is prioritising the presence of the text over the interpretation done by the reader. And that might be a poor design choice. We've looked at all sorts of modern reading devices like the Amazon Kindle and Sony Reader. They tend to basically follow all the problems of the desktop, but they have the additional problem that usually don't have very complex input tools, like you don't have a mouse or a keyboard. They sometimes are good at position, but they can't type, or vice versa. Okay, so let's just nail this on the head now with a few last thoughts. There are 4 things I think could be quite useful, which I'll just quickly throw ourselves into. The idea of script acts. If you attended Jeffrey Yao's talk, he talked about this briefly in passing. A guy called Peter Schillingsburg, who's a professor of literature, comes up with the idea that script acts are a particular form of speech act that happens when readers are constructing meaning, and even authors aren't too sure what they mean. It's good enough to get it onto the page. Now, if that is the case, then that tells us actually that this constructing meaning is quite an important part, so I don't think we're completely mad if literature scholars are saying similar things. But if that is the case, then all the evidence that Cathy Marshall, Abigail Selin, and Kenton O'Hara, HCI people, say that where this doodling inside isn't just doodling, it has meaning, if you will, I think actually has a connection with that view. In cognition, we also have the idea of resilience. Humans make errors. Systems do not work. And people are very good at overcoming those faults and failures. And we term that cognitive resilience, the ability to be able to keep going when everything around you is losing its head, or even you've lost your own. So a nurse, for instance, might put a post-it on a device that she finds hard to use in order to remind herself of the right exact procedure to go through to confirm that the right dose has been given to the patient. It's her deliberate intention to manage her own personal effectiveness. And this actually hasn't, as a concept, been applied to reading. And I think, in fact, if we're looking at a task that's been interrupted, we ought to be looking at it. And also, I think genre is an important issue here, which is the various taxonomies of reading that Andrew Dillon and Cathy Marshall and so on of reading have been applied to reading in many ways, but I think we don't yet understand how they exactly relate to user behaviour and predicting it. And I think genre is also about the form of interaction between the user and the text because of their task, and it also is partly about the user's understanding of what a text might afford them. And I don't think these methods cover all that ground yet. So where does that leave us? Reading's clearly a far from understood task. I'm certainly confused about it. We've moved, I think, from trying to understand the mechanics, which is actually, I don't think, where the real problems are, but in fact it's this interaction level which I think is driving user behaviour. Because we have Wu and others who have reported this short, snappy reading, but if the whole technology you're using disrupts continuous attention, is it not natural that the user changes their behaviour accordingly? And I would suggest that we actually can intentionally change, and Jen's shown that some changes can be made in a way that changes a cognitive experience of reading, and that will actually, I argue, lead to different forms of engagement with the actual text itself. We have to also think that this would improve the effectiveness of digital books, and as more stuff becomes available digitally for academia as a community, this is actually a question for us all, whether or not we're HCI people or information or library science or desktop publishers or whatever. So for the future, I think we can look to taking the models that we have, and I suggest mixing those more with ideas such as resilience from cognition and psychology will be a fruitful area to look at. We need a lot more primary research on the actual way in which users attend to and engage with their text. The sort of reading observations we have don't quite service that yet, which is not to fault what has been done. I've learned immensely from it, but we have more yet to do. And genre of the material and the task of reading, there are people who started on this, but I think we need more there too. I still think we need to remember digital can have advantages. I'm a historian and I love lots of old books. I have far too many expensive old books myself. But digital can have advantages. And I think we have to understand that even as we try to address some of the deficits of paper, we should also be questioning, why is search not used? If it's so good, why is it not used? Does it have to be used that much? And we can't go back to paper to answer that question. We also can't go back to the paper to worry about the issues like undo. But also, there's ways in which navigating within the book has been taken more or less based on the web experience of having no structure, or very limited structure. When I've done mobile research, we actually used what's called an outline view browser, which in effect gets something like a table of contents. But both the table of contents and the back of the book type index, and there's some stuff I've done there that I've not had time to talk about today, I think are things we should return to and consider because they were there for a reason. And I don't think those reasons disappeared overnight just because we turned the text into digital. I don't think search, in fact I can prove search doesn't replace that feature. I'd like to thank Tom, Fernando and Jen, who are my students, and pretty much this is mostly their stuff, I have to be clear. Thanks to Edie for inviting me to come here, and to Luann, Rick and Heather and Eric, who have in various ways helped me through this week. And there are lots of references, but I would suggest that this one text from Kathy Marshall is a very good place to start. Thank you very much. Have you any questions?
So I'm going to come around with the microphone.
Hi there.
Hi.
Can you go back to your interface slide if you don't mind?
Oh, which one? This one?
Yep, that's fine.
Yep.
So it seems like you've really gone out of your way to emulate a physical book, right down to the Post-it note metaphor and everything else.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you think that is really essential to kind of minimizing this cognitive burden in such a way that it's really better not to add too many features that are novel to a digital environment beyond even Control F and undo and hypertext.
Oh yeah, there were lots of reasons for doing this. Like, my PhD was in hypertext, so I'm not anti-hypertext. But basically, one of the things that we know in HCI is what's called the tool selection problem. So the more tools I give you, the more and more time it takes to decide. Now, one of the things we think is actually gone wrong with the digital tech control, the digital book, is that we've given like 20 options where there used to be 3. So strangely enough, you have to remember which tools will work, and then you have to remember how to use them, which is just bad. Now, yeah, it looks like a traditional book, and we wanted to give that affordance to suggest what the behavior might be. But I would caution that, some people have said, oh, but we're just following the book slavishly. It's like, no, there are quite a lot of small details in there where we don't. For example, you can resize those post-its. You can change their colour without reprinting them. And also, in fact, there's a couple of other things that's not on this slide where you can just do a cut and paste where it becomes an active link that you can't do in the real book. So, yeah, I would agree with your caution that over-following the metaphor of the original text is not a good thing. But there are the reasons why we have followed them because we want to change the interaction style. If paper had not been like that, we probably wouldn't have followed it.
Do we have some other questions?
I just want to ask, what is a speech act?
Okay, so a speech act is it's been created by John Searle, and I should remember Austin's first name. Does anyone remember from Wednesday? I'm having a senior moment there. But a speech act is basically to understand when two people are communicating with each other, both the person who is speaking and the listener is involved in interpreting the communication.
You mean it's a conversation?
Well, it's a conversation, but it's also that there are particular types of information are communicated. There's a whole taxonomy that follows with it. But if you Google, to mention the dreadful term, Speech Act and John Searle, S-E-A-R-L-E, you'll find a better rendition than I could give justice to in a few seconds.
What is HCI?
Human-computer interaction. So that's my area of computer science. Itself rather a long and verbose term, unfortunately. We didn't really think about that too well as a discipline, did we?
Justine, any other question?
Hi, thanks for the talk. And I'm sort of interested in your reading and information seeking model, which seemed to go fairly linearly from seeking through triage, reading, and chaining. Could you talk about the interesting ways in which that short circuits and how that informs the way we look for and read?
Okay, so let me go back to that then. Because I always worry about arrows in models because people then assume it's linear. And I'm Irish. We're rhapsodic. We don't do symphonies. So it's not about linear. But there is this point at which my student Fernando has a nice model called the funnel model, which says it's more about a narrowing down. But it lacks, the problem is that then how do you get the funnel back up to the top? So one of the things that can happen in finding information is that sometimes you actually might find the answer even, quote unquote, at the search result list level, in which case you've not read any documents. Like, you can imagine if you search for Napoleon Bonaparte birth, you might in a snippet see the date, and you might even just take that on trust. I wouldn't, but you might. So there's clearly some cases where that might be a short circuit within this diagram, one way or other. Equally, and this certainly has happened to me, when I've been triaging documents, I'm trying to figure out if they're relevant or not. I've occasionally cast my eye and gone, that's interesting. And that's taken me off straight towards chaining, where I'm going, actually I want to find out more about Bernardo O'Higgins for the sake of argument. So there are obviously cuts between this. And I sort of feel I probably should have thick arrows descending to thin arrows or something like that. I only drew this yesterday. But I think the reason I sort of drew this is I actually think this act of chaining through to new avenues of study or seeking isn't actually something that usually tends to be tooled. We just do it in our heads. I certainly do it in my head. And I suspect, actually, this is one where if we had digital tools that were properly lightweight in Kathy Marshall's term, we could actually think of there being an implicit scrapbook that just builds up as we try to remember stuff. Because I know my memory is not, I've got a pretty good memory actually, but it's not all it could be in this regard. And the number of times I find myself rediscovering things after 3 or 4 months is just a bit silly. It's not a very good way of managing my time. I feel tempted to go into a Blackadder sketch, but I won't. But I think actually it's that bottom part where I think we might want to understand what are the strategies that people are using there. And I don't think we've done that. So it's more in effect to make us think about what are we doing at that bottom piece, for me, at this moment, which might make it a terrible model. It might be just too personally biased.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up for time, but maybe Luann can ask her question after. I'd just like to thank George again for the talk,
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and asking such great questions.
Thank you all very much.